trans travelers for whom mobility is difficult, and also the discussion of syringes ignores other health issues. By making note of the exceptions, but failing to address their racial, religious, and ableist undertones, the advocacy organization continues to marginalize voices for whom gender variance is only one aspect of potential discrimination, and reinstitutes the problematic construction of trans bodies as largely white and able-bodied. The vulnerability of TSA agents is also exacerbated with the new AIT devices and pat-down procedures. TSA agents have really high turnover rates and poor training, and in general no training about trans issues, which leads to TSA agents being abused by peers and supervisors. In 2011, the TSA came under fire for their abuse and subsequent firing of Ashley Yang, a trans woman working as a TSA agent in the LAX airport. According to interviews, the agent, who passed as female and was listed as female on her driver's license but had not yet had sex reassignment surgery, was forced by supervisors to cut her hair, dress as a man, use the men's restroom, and give pat-downs to male travelers who, quote, recognizing her still feminine appearance, said comments such as, "I haven't had a girl touch me for a long time." As a result of the woman filing a civil rights lawsuit against the airport, TSA has mandated transgender sensitivity training for its managers at LAX. By no indication has this training been extended to staff beyond the managers at LAX or any other airports. Thus, while the TSA claims to be a diverse workplace, it offers little substantial support for its workers. The discourse of now, which argues that everyone is vulnerable to terror and that surveillance is the only preventative measure, which is taken up by the TSA and unquestioned by advocacy organizations, puts non-normative bodies of all kinds at a greater risk for abuse. Therefore, dominant discourse of vulnerability, rather than protecting individuals and diminishing vulnerability, is the primary factor in maintaining the precarity of non-normative travelers and agents. Arguably, there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope in this situation. However, recent moves to unionize TSA workers or allow them to unionize might improve the working environment, which in turn might decrease turnover and enable the retention of effectively trained workers. If advocacy organizations continue to push for training that attends to the needs of trans travelers and staff, there's a possibility that instances of harassment will decrease both for the traveling public and for the agents. And additionally, and the thing that was most interesting to me, the new body scanners have opened up generally normative populations to state scrutiny, in particular breast cancer patients who are using prosthesis in order to perform gender along the lines that they're used to. So in the concluding chapter of my thesis, I argue, citing Butler, that the shared experience of vulnerability by breast cancer patients and trans travelers might offer the opportunity for a new coalition against state oppression, or at the very least, renewed public attention to the mistreatment and dehumanization of trans individuals by the state.
Great, thanks so much. We're going to move questions until after everyone's presented, and next we're going to hear from Saffo, who is going to talk about even a freak like you would be safe in Tel Aviv, towards a psychoanalytic reading of transphobia, pinkwashing, and the Zionist economy of attitude.
Thank you. So before I get started on my paper, I wanted to introduce a couple things that have been sort of going back and forth in my head this morning. You know, I have this paper written, and I was thinking, is this what I want to present, or do I want to change what I'm thinking? And one of the things that I keep coming back to is this question of what this space is. So we have this kind of hybrid space here in this conference that is, you know, a hybrid activist academic space, quote unquote, whatever that means. So I wanted to speak about that for a second before I go into my paper. But one of the things I keep coming back to is this question of what does a hybrid activist academic space do? Is this a good thing? And it's something that I feel this constant tension with, and I know I'm not the only one here who does. So I wanted to bring that up. And one of the things I keep thinking about with this is, you know, so there's this kind of utopian vision that some people have had in the past several generations of the idea of like tearing down the doors of the academy, right? We're gonna tear down the doors of the academy. We're gonna liberate this knowledge. We're gonna create open collaborative spaces. And I obviously sympathize with that project to a certain extent. But then there's this question of, is that a neoliberal fantasy? Is that a neoliberal fantasy akin to the fantasy that neoliberalism will tear down the borders of the nation state? I don't like the nation state, but I'm also wary of who's tearing down what boundaries and to what ends. And so this is the thing that I keep coming back to is, because when we destabilize these things, we create these new alternative spaces that create new alternative kinds of tension that we don't have a map for. We don't have a way to navigate. It's not the same as the academy in the 50s and 60s. It's not the same struggle of oh, here's the academy up there on the hill in the ivory tower. It's like, no, here's all these delocalized spaces of academic performance and academic knowledge production that's held together in a kind of neoliberal framework. And so this tension for me as, for instance, as an openly trans woman who's also openly anti-Zionist and is still ascribing to this dream of, the deferred gratification of the academic tenure track. I'll be honest. That's a huge part of. That's one of the many reasons why I'm here. It's the carrot that keeps many of us going, and the division to telos. And so, what does it mean to combine that with one's organizing? Is something that there's a part of me that's very much like, no. I would like to have my academic work over here and my organizing work over here, and never the two shall meet. And so it was this constant question as I was preparing, how do I want to perform in this space? How do I want to engage with this space? Am I here as an activist? Am I here as an academic? And I think so. I wanted to bring that up as part of, I think, one of the tensions that I think this conference needs to engage with, and some of the difficult questions that we need to ask ourselves as quote unquote activist academics. What are we creating here? So, sorry, I'm probably going over my time, but that's my introduction. Perhaps it's in the anxiety itself, the present absence of the threat of heckling. Most people involved in Palestine solidarity organizing have dealt with pinkwashing in one form or another. But as a non-passing trans woman, my body serves as an open invitation for pinkwashing. The anxiety itself serves as a kind of disciplining, part of the larger project which produce the very kind of homonationalist subject it seeks to describe. Within this logic, there is no room for the existence of visibly queer bodies engaged in anti-Zionist organizing. Quote, what are you? If you're not a male or female, perhaps something in between, then can you explain to me your ridiculous and ignorant hate against the only country in the Middle East that someone like you could live a peaceful life, almost without prejudice, having the law on your side, also having the same rights as a male or female heterosexual? Because, darling, someone like you would be strung up by your pigtails and stoned to death, tortured or imprisoned in any of those peace-loving, democratic, non-judgmental Muslim countries that surround Israel. Unquote. This is just one of the many comments I've received from Zionists in response to my participation in BDS actions. This particular comment was directed to me in response to an action against TIAA-CREF's investment in the occupation. It wasn't a queer event, and I was the only one singled out for this heckling. The very presence of my visibly queer body is enough to invite a response of pinkwashing. My starting point is rather simple, and I'm focusing on sort of autoethnographic account, and I want to acknowledge that I'm situated in the West, so I'm not trying to universalize this, but my starting point is that this pinkwashing is a kind of incitement to discourse, a hail of the visibly queer subject. How dare you care about Palestine? You're a tranny. This properly delimited trans/homonationalist subject, I would say transnationalist, but that word is unfortunately already taken, is essentially one confined to an apoliticized space of pride parades and gay bars, but never the front lines of an anti-imperial or anti-colonial project. Quote, the greatest irony is that faggot at the end of your video would have his sick throat sliced if he, sick, took 2 steps into Gaza, unquote. There's a particular kind of projection at play here within this hail. The absent Palestinian here becomes a site onto which queerphobic Zionists may project their queerphobic fantasies. This is slightly different from Fanon's notion of colonial phobia and the phobogenic object. For Fanon, the phobogenic object may be one who is not present, as in his reading of the white settler's fear of the absent black person. In this case, however, the object of the phobia, i.e. me, is present, but the subject of that phobia is projected onto an absent subject, the imagined homophobic violence of Palestinians in Gaza. Quote, I would like to see what people would do to that tall Boy George lookalike if he, sick, went to Gaza City dressed like that, unquote. This projection accomplishes several things. It allows the queerphobic Zionist to live out his own queerphobic fantasy while simultaneously positioning himself as the savior of victimized queers. It also serves to delimit the spaces in which queers may engage publicly. This is not your place. How dare you care about genocide and ethnic cleansing? We have gay bars in Tel Aviv. I'm sure even a freak like you would feel safe there. The traumas of both capitalism and queerphobia and the very narrowly delimited spaces in which queerness may exist within the metropole have conspired to produce the subject of the metro/cosmopolitan queer consumer, normalizing the neoliberalization of queerness into a consumption ethic which can only exist in the city. What pinkwashing does is mimetically both draw on and reify this neoliberal homonationalist subject. Pride parades, drag shows, gay bars, all form part of this neoliberal assemblage of what a homonormative consumer is supposed to look like. The violence of this kind of hail occurs precisely because the visibly transgender anti-Zionist activist does not fit the logic of homonormative neoliberal consumer. In effect, what this hail does is ask the visibly queer subject, why can't you be more like Michael Lucas? According to Althusser, the hail serves to interpolate the individual into the subject, to bring the individual into ideology. This kind of Zionist heckle is an attempt to interpolate me into the Zionist economy of gratitude. Zionists love to ask me, quote, how would you fare in Gaza? To which I love to respond, how would I get to Gaza? There's a certain kind of geographical operation at play here with this kind of pinkwashing. Through Zionist pinkwashing heckling, one gets hailed into a kind of homonationalist geography, which implies a certain kind of universal gay/queer/trans subjecthood. Because of this universality, the Western transgender subject can suddenly find herself discursively teleported to Gaza. How would you fare in Gaza? What is that even supposed to mean? It implies a kind of transit, which can then be spun around. How would I get to Gaza? Responds by drawing attention to that transit, drawing attention to the geographical specificities of the violence of Zionism. So I want to turn now to the question of what the transgender subject is being held into, i.e. what kind of spatial, temporal, geographical, and historical narratives and counter-narratives are at play in both pinkwashing and the responses to pinkwashing. And so I wanted to draw an example. In 2005, the tellingly named studio After Stonewall Productions released a film titled, quote-unquote, Dangerous Living, Coming Out in the Developing World. This film featured interviews with various LGBT activists from various countries outside the West, spliced up and lumped together haphazardly, with the overarching message that A, it is not safe to be queer in the quote-unquote developing world, B, what queer spaces do exist in the developing world are to be found in certain metropolises, Cairo, Kuala Lumpur, Calcutta, Rio de Janeiro, and C, that these sites trace their genealogy to the Stonewall riots, and the overarching savior narrative towards the end occurs when each interviewee, one by one, tells their story of immigrating to the West. The narrative posited by the Gay International and demonstrated by this film roughly can be summed up as such. Queerness/gayness and sometimes transness, when it's acknowledged, was invented in the West. Epistemic breaking points such as the Stonewall riots and canonized locales such as San Francisco and Greenwich Village are the originating points of this innovation against the backdrop of a timeless, pervasive heterosexism. This cosmopolitan gayness/queerness then spreads from the metropole to the periphery, forming a web from city to city. This is imbued with a classical, recapitulationist, developmentalist temporality, in which the non-West has to catch up with the West. Rainbow flags, pride parades, gay bars eventually arrive in the post-colony as symbols of progress and modernity, something that one is told to find liberatory. Furthermore, these always take place in cities in the South, never in the village. This coincides with Jack Halberstam's unfortunately US-centric analysis in his book In a Queer Time and Place, in which what he describes as metrocentrism. Halberstam argues that the coming out narrative gets projected onto a movement from the rural to the urban. We can extend this further and see the ways that the closet/rural/post-colony, as well as out/urban/metropole, get collapsed into each other. But if we were to trace the history of these signifiers, i.e. signifiers such as the terms gay, queer, trans, rainbow flags, etc., we might find a partial truth in this narrative. They form a network in space and time, and each step along the way, of course, these terms are reappropriated, lexicalized, given different shape and different context. And so I want to attempt sort of a vastly oversimplified historical overview. So here's my overview. Before colonialism and continuing to this day, various articulations and epistemes of what we may roughly translate as gender, sexuality, and desire have existed and continue to exist across the world. These epistemes could form oppressive regimes in their own right, as well as articulations of what one today may problematically call queer. In the metropolitan industrialized West, of which the settler colonial United States became a part through various waves of colonization, industrialization, and modernization, certain vile colonial regimes of gender and sexuality were formed, including what we would call Western patriarchy and heteronormativity. These regimes have articulated and re-articulated upon themselves various biopolitics over the course of history. A vital part of its formulation was formed through the processes of colonization and industrialization. Out of this eventually came the signifiers we know today as gay, as well as queer and trans. These formulations did not happen evenly, even in the West. As we know, the urban-rural divide is enormous here, even among white settler societies. At no point was this process ever clear or clean-cut. Western and non-Western, modern and non-modern, urban and rural forms of gender and sexuality have interpenetrated and informed each other through mimetic processes, while simultaneously mediated by a larger overarching structure of capitalist/colonial modernity. Gay Marxist historian John D'Amelio, in his 1983 article Capitalism and Gay Identity, anticipated some of these arguments. However, I believe we can read in D'Amelio some of the formations of both my own temporality and the narrative posited by the Gay International. D'Amelio correctly notes that gay and lesbian as identity formations were historically produced by capitalism. They were not transcendent, transhistorical signifiers of a particular configuration of desire. However, D'Amelio still conflates the two, equating gay liberation in a typical Marxist teleological fashion with the rise of capitalism and move towards a liberatory utopia. His historicism is useful, although his teleology is not. What we can take from this, however, is that holding onto a stable subject position of gay and lesbian in the fashion that D'Amelio does can clearly become colonial, and for this we turn to Joseph Massad's notion of the Gay International. I would suggest that this coloniality is the same practice as Marxist colonialism. For instance, consider Soviet discourse about Chechnya and Chechens, who were lumpen proletariats who needed to go through all the proper stages of capitalist displacement and alienation in order to reach the telos of proletarian subjectivity necessary for socialism. Part of the problem here is that the subject of the proletariat contains within it the capitalist displacement that was necessary for the production of the proletariat. Hence, a kind of jealous gaze is directed towards those who have not yet experienced this alienation, or are perceived as not experiencing this alienation, especially, for instance, indigenous tribes who have not been fully assimilated into capitalism. This is essentially the same kind of temporal colonialism carried out by the Gay International. The point I want to make in outlining this rough historical sketch and critique is to argue this one point. Industrial metropoles in the West produced the alienation, displacement, and heteropatriarchy necessary for these queer subjectivities to take root. The very need for confrontational queer politics happened as a reaction to the hegemony of straightness in the industrialized West. Capitalism produced straightness, and then it produced queerness out of that. That is, if we were concerned with the signifier queer, not the signified. The focus on semiotics is significant in that it responds to many of the criticisms of Joseph Massad. The hail with which I began this paper serves to interpolate the visibly queer subject into the Zionist/Gay International economy of gratitude. In this economy, the queer/trans subject is forever indebted to capital/colonial modernity. This modernity, in fact, contains within it the very rupture of displacement which produced the proletariat class and heteropatriarchy necessary to sustain capital production. Part of the problem with identity politics, and particularly the kind of identity politics deployed by Zionism and pinkwashing, is that it contains within it a fetishization of its own victimization narrative. In the case of the documentary Dangerous Living, which I mentioned earlier, the displacement of the queer from the rural to urban, from post-colonial to metropole, fetishizes that displacement, reifies it. This is similar to the discursive operation of colonial archaeology and historiography in the 19th century that were necessary to build the foundations of Zionism. As Ella Shohat demonstrates, Ashkenazi appropriations of Arab Jewish history, such as the destruction of the Cairo Geniza by Western Jews, and the appropriation of, in this case, Egyptian Jewish history within a narrative of Jewish history rather than Egyptian history, formed the foundations of Zionism, particularly the partitioning of the signifiers Jew and Arab as discrete categories, and the exploitation of Mizrahi labor and Mizrahi bodies in Israel. It is especially worth noting, as Shohat does, that the destruction of the Cairo Geniza, the discursive displacement of Arab Jews, predated the actual destruction and displacement of Arab Jewish communities by the better part of a century. This kind of Foucauldian will to knowledge and discursive violence is similarly at play in the discursive displacement of queer and trans subjects and is instrumental to the Zionist economy of gratitude. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Saffo. Now on to Eli Avidan, who will be talking about, or attempting to answer the question, is the Zionist body transgender? Borders of niche and gender.
It's actually Eli.
Oh,
yeah. When I was an 18-year-old girl, I was drafted to the Israeli army as any other high school graduate and sent to a military course designated to train me to be a professional evaluator of the abilities and mental and emotional state of Israeli teenagers prior to their enlistment to the army. Since Hebrew is a highly gendered language, and this was in non-combat positions for girls and a few boys with asthma, the closest translation to the way people actually called us would be psychotechnic evaluatresses. I knew quite a lot about this course since my parents first met there. When I was growing up, my father used to joke and say that he was an evaluatress based on the common assumption that it was a female position. But when I say today that I was an evaluatress, I'm not kidding, rather than insisting to acknowledge my female past. This makes me wonder, did my father's words even back then enable me to consider a form of masculinity which does not reject feminine signifiers? Do they have something in common with my masculinity today? I would argue that in order to consolidate itself as a masculine sign in the service of Zionism, the Israeli nation must continually exercise femininity from male bodies. Thus, I keep wondering, could my father's words offer me means to appropriate masculinity without submitting to the severe gender decrees of Israeli hegemony? Orit Kamil argues that in 19th century Europe, the Jewish people were considered feminine since they hadn't had land, sovereignty, or armies, since the male Jews were visibly more feminine than non-Jewish men, as they rarely engaged in physical activities, and even because of the ritual circumcision, which a phallocentric approach would consider as feminization of the body. As Michael Glusman argues, Zionist literature from the beginning of the 20th century had explained Jewish oppression as a result of Jewish femininity and took on a project of gender rehabilitation focused on changing the physical practices of Jewish men. Zionism accepted the misogynistic view that masculinity is necessary to sustain a nation and complied with the anti-Semitic concept that Jews were feminine. Thus, the masculinization of Judaism was seen as a vital stage of the construction of the Jewish nation. Since the implementation of national aspirations leaned on the process of gender transformation, I would like to argue that gender reassignment is an enabling force for Zionism and Israeli ideology, and in that respect, the Jewish nation could be seen as a female-to-male transgender nation. This form of gender transformation includes two vital components. Firstly, it is based on misogynist understanding of femininity as a national hazard. Therefore, the removal of femininity from male bodies is set as a means to stabilize the nation and protect its borders. Secondly, it engages a somewhat Butlerian view of gender as performance, since masculinity is not understood as the essence of maleness, but as a state that can be reached by the right kind of performance. The fluid nature of gender thus functions as a major problem in Zionism, since if masculinity could be implemented into male bodies, then femininity could also reoccupy them. Therefore, the eradication of femininity has become an infinite and almost obsessive task, which must be performed systematically in order to maintain Israeli sovereignty. An institution which has a major role in carrying out this task is the IDF, the Israeli army. Orna Sasson-Levy argues that in Israel, the IDF is regarded as an organization that improves men physically, culturally, and morally by making them more masculine. Furthermore, she suggests that this masculinization of Israeli males is constructed physically through arduous combat training, which accentuate binarized sexual differences and remove femininity from male bodies as a means of protecting the borders of the nation. Thereby, the IDF constructs a link between masculinity and sovereignty, which is easily conceived as a natural product of masculinity. In this process, not only is the constructed nature of masculinity being camouflaged by its own process of construction, it is also being concealed through the production of sexual difference as the reason for IDF's gender hierarchy. Sasson-Levy quotes from many interviews with male soldiers who claim that female soldiers could not perform as well as they do, whether physically, professionally, or intellectually, because of their physical difference. These views strengthen the perception that sexual differences are indeed natural, situating masculinity as a male essence and obscuring its process of production. Therefore, gynophobia works as a national defense mechanism, both in the literal sense, in its role in creation of masculine soldiers for the protection of the nation, and in a more conceptual sense, in its role in stabilizing binary gender and concealing gender fluidity. Both of these roles of gynophobia are exposed in the case of gender subversion in the IDF. As Eyal Gross argues, the military service of homosexual men constitutes a security risk for the nation. I argue that this risk is the option of femininity reoccupying male bodies. Gay men signify the failure of national gender transformation, since their bodies hold the possibility of being penetrated, which echoes the anxiety of a Palestinian invasion of the national body. A simple example to this similarity is the two common uses of the conquering metaphor in Hebrew. One to describe forceful military actions and the other to depict heterosexual sexual practices. In both cases, the male motto to fuck 'em refers to an occupation of marginal penetratable bodies by a normative male body, and so when the soldier's body becomes penetratable, a national security risk rises. A different example is the service of female soldiers in masculine positions, such as combat training instructors. In contrast to Halberstam's notion that female masculinity is prohibited after puberty, Sasson-Levy shows that in the case of the Israeli female soldiers serving as commanders and instructors, masculinity is not only acceptable, but even encouraged, as it is viewed as a suitable performance of a masculine role in service. Although she claims that this possibility could lead to gender subversion, it is important to note that the framework of gender crossing is constituted by the needs of the nation. Moreover, the preservation of the connection between holding the position of authority and being masculine works to reinforce the attachment of masculine performance to qualities such as control and rationality. This link leads to an appropriation of masculinity that is also based on the rejection of femininity. And perhaps that is why these masculine female soldiers use misogynistic speech to describe feminine women, disregard sexual harassment and blame the victim, and embrace militaristic and violent ideals. Even if the gender transformation of these soldiers could suggest that masculinity is not an essence of maleness and loosen the tie between these categories, it is also retying the knot between masculinity, misogyny, xenophobia, and the subjugation of the other. Moreover, the positions these soldiers are filling are not considered male but masculine. This difference helps to maintain the boundary between male origin and female orientation and sustain the belief that gender differentiates biologically. Although the female soldier's masculine performance subverts binarized gender difference, the physical is set as means of differentiation. Thus, women are re-signified as a separate group. The constructed nature of gender is reconciled, and gender is re-embedded in the physical. This process strengthens the common perception, as Connell puts it, that true masculinity proceeds from male bodies. Since the Israeli military system produces and reaffirms a connection between gender and nation, body and land, it works as a gender regulation mechanism, which shapes Israeli culture as a transgendered culture in a state of deep denial. Within it, gender crossing in unregulated ways arouses anxiety, not only of transgressing the gender boundaries, but of breaching national borders as well. At the end of my Psychotechnic Evaluatrix's course, we decided to make our own printed t-shirts to capture the spirit of our course, a very common ritual in the Israeli military sphere. This decision started a loud argument between 90 girls who wanted the t-shirts to say evaluatrices and 8 boys who outrightly refused. While the t-shirt the boys wanted was the one that which bestow upon them the honor of finishing male military courses, a t-shirt with the female pronoun would only prove that they haven't earned it in the end of common training, and so in a way they needed to insist on using a male pronoun in order to re-establish their doubtful masculinity. This removal of femininity from the course t-shirt is equivalent to any removal of femininity, which is the requirement for a believable, real and natural masculinity. In Hebrew, the plural form is always male, unless the group described contains only females. The boys used this proper, clean rule as their winning argument in the t-shirt battle. Even though those boys weren't masculine enough to go through combat training and could not produce their masculinity by physically eradicating both the feminized enemy and their own femininity, they did succeed in doing so through another kind of hegemonic erasure of femininity, its erasure from language. Therefore, it may be that the difference between my father and I saying we used to be evaluatrices is not that great after all. Maybe, as Halberstam claims, we are all transsexuals in a sense that, as Santi Stone argues, transvisibility could be potentially subversive. Although my father was making a joke, and I'm refusing to erase my past, both of our statements oppose the construction of the feminine as the dark secret of Jewish masculinity, and expose that which is being concealed by Zionism, that our genders are only fixated by in the service of occupation, that potentially we are all transgendered, and that detaching our bodies of flesh from our bodies of nation could reveal this potential and pull out the rug from under the structures of anxiety which maintain the logic of occupation. Thank you.
Last but not least, Taylor Cruz will be presenting on Decolonizing Transformative Technologies on Transgender Healthcare and Imperialism. Taylor.
So before I start, I just wanted to say that everything that I'm presenting on is pretty preliminary. I'm going to be pursuing a project on this subject next year, so if anyone has any suggestions or critiques, I'm totally open. Okay, so today we'll be presenting some preliminary findings on several tensions within the context of transgender health and global medical care. With widening disparities in the economic distribution of capital and the rising cost of all forms of medical care, medical tourism is increasingly presented as an attractive option for those disenfranchised within the U.S. Participation in this phenomenon, however, is inseparably tied to power dynamics that shift resources towards American subjects and away from localized health initiatives. In the first part of this presentation, I seek to situate medical tourism within the context of post-colonialism and global techno-capitalism. Following this, I will present a case study on the Satora World Medical Group, a company that facilitates the navigation of international medical spaces for transgender patients seeking sex reassignment surgery. The combination of the combination of material economic realities, international global power dynamics, and the linear narrative of science and medicine lends itself to the complicity of existing regimes of power that center American transgender transition beyond a contained fixed location. Medical tourism describes the phenomena of travel between countries in seek of medical care coupled with an individual leisure-oriented mindset. This process may consist of travel between developed and developing countries or between countries of similar social and economic development. In this paper, I use the terms developed and developing as a means of attending to power differentials on a country level during a time of global capitalism and stratified inequality, despite recognizing its limited use as a binary description. Within the context of post-colonial considerations, this paper is primarily concerned with the travel of individuals from developed countries to developing countries to access medical care, and how such travel brings into question notions of global queerness medical standards and authority, and the role of medicine in facilitating queerness. While medical tourism itself is not new, its relatively recent rise can be attributed to rising costs of treatment in developed countries, the affordability of international travel, and the increasing uptake of use of technology within health and developing medical systems. Globalization facilitates the compression of technology and ideas across space and time. The increased use of medical technologies developed in Western contexts within non-Western contexts symbolizes this globalization. Medical tourism brings individuals from developed countries to the medical spaces of developing countries and provides treatments often designed for individuals living in developed spaces. Thus, this phenomenon consists of displacing technologies, ideas, and epistemologies and employing them in additional localities. From a post-colonial perspective, this brings larger issues into play. Who is medicine for locally and globally? How should resources be utilized in developing countries? How might the socially constructed nature of technology reveal itself when technology is experienced in a different physical context? And how do certain values become embedded within all forms of consumption, including medical treatment, that speak to unequal power relations between developed and developing countries? Cruz et al. Suggests that for developing tourist destinations, quote, engaging in medical tourism relegates them to the role of conforming to the values, needs, and standards determined by the dominant center. In essence, they are service providers in an all-inclusive medical resort, end quote. Yet this conformity within medical tourism is not simply a side effect of seeking to maximize consumer benefit. Without it, there would be no consumers at all in developing countries seeking medical treatments. Clients, in effect, need to be sold on the comparability of treatment to that provided in developed contexts in terms of outcome, safety, and quality. Turner cites examples of signaling quality such as physician training in Western countries, U.S. board certification, and international accreditation, working predominantly for the consumer. Marketing takes on the crucial role of translating medical care over there into the realm of possibility in which care over there looks the same as care here, with one crucial difference: price. This is particularly facilitated by online information, as the internet allows individuals to seek out their own health information as active agents in seeking out treatment. This consumer mindset is thought to be further warranted when taking into consideration that most of the treatments sought during medical travel are not covered by insurance and are paid out of pocket. Transgender individuals in the U.S. are often under and unemployed due to the rampant discrimination they face. As some of the most economically vulnerable within the U.S., these individuals may have difficulty seeking care at home, whether related to issues of transitioning or not. Furthermore, discrimination within the healthcare system here creates additional barriers to seeking needed medical care. While some have suggested that the new standards of care for transgender, transsexual, and gender nonconforming people improve the relationship between medical professionals and transgender individuals, tensions regarding diagnostic categories, medical authority, and access to treatment ensue. Yet these issues are predominantly only understood through access to treatment, rather than challenging the content of treatment itself. In doing so, medical treatments are seen to develop as linear narratives. This linear narrative allows for the belief that technology and medical treatments are neutral entities and can transcend cultural and social contexts. The uptake of technology within developing contexts serves to establish claims of legitimacy, development, and effectiveness specifically for tourist individuals from developed countries. In the case of the transgender medical tourist, a sole preoccupation of access to treatment evokes a reminder of the severe corporal and economic realities that trans individuals face. For Irving, the transsexual body achieves its claims of legitimacy through forces of economic production. Quote, to move toward achieving social recognition, the transsexual body must constitute a productive working body. That is, it must be capable of participating in capitalist production processes, end quote. Irving argues that capitalist relations mediate transgender subjectivities in a way that limits emancipatory futures. Too often, however, there is too little discussion on how transgender individuals themselves actively participate within regimes of power despite facing severe hardships on a daily basis. Quote, transsexual people often live in a marginalized existence in which they are unable to secure legal employment, housing, and any other rudimentary needs. The urgency stemming from the dire circumstances in which many transsexual people find themselves fosters commentary that veers away from a critical analysis of the socioeconomic and political context that structures trans subjectivities and objection. In the next section of this paper, I will place these considerations within the context of medical tourism and international regimes of power. So last year, I received a Facebook invite to an event at a local LGBT center. This event offered details about, quote, affordable, high-quality surgery for transgender individuals. Intrigued as both a trans person and an academic, I attended with a friend who was seriously considering facial surgeries among other things at the time. Taking from an event description, quote, this workshop provides a step-by-step guide on the requirements for GRS, available options, what to look for when researching hospitals and doctors. Hospital and doctor highlights GRS costs and savings, passport guidelines, and what to expect when traveling for GRS surgery, end quote. Of course, this workshop serves the purpose of educating a consumer base about the best way that needs should be met. Because international travel for sex reassignment surgery is not a new phenomenon, Satori seeks to convince potential customers that the company offers a one-of-a-kind experience, hassle-free international travel that combines reliable quality surgery with low prices. So this is an example of an event, and Satori has overall been traveling the country and attending a lot of transgender health conferences. In doing so, the Satori World Medical Group reveals its role as a broker. For a one-time fee, the company offers to review medical records and eligibility, coordinate all hospital arrangements, transfer existing medical records securely to an international physician, assist in obtaining an international visa, book hotel, airfare, and concierge service, and provide the surgical service through an existing provider. Of utmost importance, however, is the emphasis on quality of care. As Turner outlines, Satori seeks to signal quality through marketing its network of providers as having been trained in Western countries at emphasizing international accreditation through the Joint Commission International, the international body that, quote, assesses the quality of healthcare facilities around the world. Accreditation by JCI is used by hospitals and medical brokerages to demonstrate that healthcare offered by a facility is of international quality, end quote. After suggesting that these are the issues that patients should take into consideration when seeking an affordable surgeon, Satori presents itself as an attractive option which already takes these issues into account. So these are some more marketing materials that are used. Furthermore, Satori also emphasized the leisure aspect of medical tourism. 4-star hotels, large accessible rooms, door-to-door service, beach lounging, and other exoticizing activities work to reinforce the emphasis on vacation. These are a few images from the company's website and Facebook that exemplify this leisure-oriented mindset. So by the end of the presentation, most of the audience seemed thrilled with the prospect of arriving at an often long-desired state of body modification at an affordable price while exploring some new country and culture through vacation. Many of these individuals I knew through my organizing with transgender and gender non-conforming individuals in the state. Several of the members were currently unemployed and nearly all lived near poverty. Some were living in temporary transitory housing after having been wrongfully forced out of their previous living situation. Irving's a reminder of the dire circumstances that transgender individuals often find themselves in needs to be placed at the center of this analysis, as these circumstances are ultimately responsible for our complicity with colonial power regimes. What is missing here then is a discussion of how engagement with these processes reifies existing power structures. For example, how has increasing demand of these services shaped the ways in which they are presented and delivered not only to foreign visitors but for local individuals as well? How does the conformity that Buzindi et al. And at manifest itself? How do local gender liminal people relate to these treatments, and how has this changed over time? How do foreign travelers relate themselves to local gender liminal people? At whose expense does this vacation and cultural exploration occur? Despite the dire social conditions that many transgender individuals experience within the U.S., global capitalism allows for even those that are marginalized here to possess forms of power through consumption, even and perhaps especially through medicine. The use of the standards of care, the physician training in the U.S., and the language through which care is provided all stress the displacement and location of Western ideals. These factors all serve to achieve legitimacy through services for subjects that are already deemed legitimate themselves. For subjects that are not legitimate, for example, individuals seeking treatment in their own developing local setting, or those who cannot even afford these international prices, these factors continue to disenfranchise their social experiences. Thus, even the marginalized here may continue to be complicit in colonial power regimes. As Irving reminds us, capitalist relations can continuously intervene and shape transgender subjectivities. By participating in these regimes of power, we are all complicit in their maintenance. Self-examination and a greater awareness of the ways in which these manifestations of power operate may provide an opportunity to open up the dialogue for how we can move towards a more globally conscious understanding of Western biomedicine and its relation to queerness.
Thanks, Taylor. I think all 4 of those papers are really fascinating. And I'll stop with one comment on each of them. They're all great. Sally, I could give you a whole bunch of experiences I've had with PSA.
Yeah.
We'll have to talk about that, including passing through, newfangled things and what happens when you pass through them and you get detained because they can't figure out what's going on. We'll talk. Saffo, I loved your paper. I thought it was fascinating. I think that CLAGS is one of those, in terms of your introduction, one of those places that tries to bridge activism and academia, and bring activists and academics together, sometimes more successfully than others. And so I think it's the tension that's inherent in spaces like this, and I'm glad you articulated that. Eli, I was fascinated by your paper. I mean, one thing that strikes me is that Israel itself, of course, was given a name. It's a male name, right? And Israel is gendered as a masculine name in most languages when you render the name of the country. And Palestine, in many languages, gendered as feminine, which I find very interesting. Israel's masculine and Palestine feminine. Anyway, so that's interesting. And Taylor, I think I've had some of the same kind of thoughts. I haven't heard them articulated quite so well as you did, but I've had some thoughts about medical tourism, and I thought it was interesting. Service for trans men and trans women. It's kind of that's very interesting. So, although oddly enough, I should say that in most languages that have gendered, that gender names of countries, Thailand, I think is masculine, and Serbia is women. So anyway, with that, I'd love to take questions and comments from all of you. Any thoughts or questions for the panel on any of the papers? Yes.
Saffo, I love your paper. Thanks very much. Thanks to all of the panelists. They were really fantastic and totally worth getting up in the morning for. Feel more awake now than I did even a couple of hours ago. I love all of what you were working with, Saffo, and in your configuration of the economy of gratitude, I think is something that so many queers and trans folks might recognize in relation to religious families, for example. You know, you should be grateful that we even let you in the house, kind of, that kind of rhetoric. But I actually am interested in what you started with, the kind of introductory notes that you started with in terms of your kind of questioning. I think you worried maybe that you were being cynical, or I thought maybe that's cynical, but it is not. About the hybrid activist academic spaces and kind of questioning what those are. And one of the things that I think about in terms of the kind of precarious employment situations of graduate students and adjunct faculty and people trying to get tenure track jobs is the way that in so many of our humanities fields, especially, being an activist functions as a kind of commodity on the job market. That if you can have a little activist page on your CV, then you have a little bit more currency. But I mean, you have to be careful, and you have to kind of curate what kind of activism you put on your CV. But I think, but this is, I mean, I want to just kind of agree with you and kind of celebrate the cynicism. Like, yes, I think so many of us write activist, artist, academic in our bios and all of those things, and we think about, think very carefully about what activities we highlight in our professional portfolios and those we don't. So I just wanted to kind of add to that, and I'm not even sure I have a question, except just to say thank you for taking the time to introduce your work that way.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing that really sticks out in my mind is, I've been back in school for about 2 years now, but I was, after my undergrad, I was out for about 3 years. And I remember, I was living in Colorado, and I was organizing stuff around BDS and Israeli Apartheid Week, and so many times, I had people assume that I was a student. And it's interesting, okay, so I'm in my 20s and I care about Palestine, and that means I must be a student. And so what does that say about the movement? I mean, to me that was that's a major red flag. That there's something we're not doing right here in terms of our solidarity activism. But I mean, I think that in terms of like I said, I think that in terms of looking at where are we at in this historical moment right now? Back in the 50s and 60s, there was the very different kind of academy that people were fighting against, right? They were fighting against this very it was a much more at least it seems so in hindsight, a much more clear-cut, the good old boys club, and it was clear, or at least we have this image that it was clear who the ivory tower was, right? And now we have this ivory tower at large, where there's, so one question I think is why, a lot of people really hate on Judith Butler and her writing, and regardless of what you think about her writing, I think it's an interesting, as an anthropologist, it's an interesting ethnographic question. Why is Judith Butler's writing coming up in so many queer spaces? Like, why is that coming up in so many? Why is it? What does it say that people are turning to this? Regardless of whether or not they're in the academy, people are turning to, oh, I'm going to read, Gender Trouble, and it's going to explain to me, like, all of the internal, like, contradictions that I'm feeling. And I crack it open, and you're like, I can't understand what she's saying. And this is a common experience that a lot of people are having. For me, I think, like, looking at, being in the academy, I think, well, her writing is dense, but it's really not much more dense than any other academic I've read. But there's something thinking socially, economically, where, what is happening? What is happening here economically, politically, that there's a kind of distribution of these texts. We're live tweeting and live streaming, and people are tweeting in questions on the live stream, like, at an academic conference, what does that say, I don't have an answer.
I'll just make one comment, which is, I think it depends on the field that you're in, whether activism is helpful or not. I did my PhD in political science, and believe me, activism was not helpful, and certainly not in the subfields I was in. In fact, it was very much frowned on because political science is a field that has kind of science editing, and the people who are more inclined in that direction are trying to make it into some sort of pure science, and activism messes that up because it's seen as having commitments outside of the purely scientific. The one field in which activism probably is right, subfield is political theory, but political theory is a very marginalized subfield within the discipline of political science. When I was on the job market, I did not talk about activism at all because I knew it would not help people occur. As I said, it depends on the department of the school, but in general, I think that's one field that does that. But I love her concept of celebratory cynicism. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Well, I'd like to kind of piggyback on the discussion that's happening. And I feel like I need to out myself as a non-academic person who's just here because I'm interested in the topic. And that being said, I'm sort of interested, this is a question for all the panelists, what you all do in your studies / potential activism to make the topics that you're interested in personally, professionally accessible to people like me who aren't necessarily in academia but are extremely interested in trans issues, queer issues, and how you might make your studies and your personal interest accessible to non-academics.
Well, I have a blog. In the past, when I've done qualitative data collection, I've kept in contact with my participants and let them know what was going on in terms of reaching out to other trans communities. I think part of it is we walk a fine line being an academic and an activist because so much of this is our friends, and then we're also trying to do research just to get ourselves noticed, I guess. So I would say, I personally, I keep a lot of local connections, and I have an online presence.
What's your blog?
It's taymarcruz.wordpress.com.
Oh, I'll admit, I am first-year PhD student, so my time is spent trying not to fail, so I can continue to have a stipend. But one thing that I have noticed in doing the research is, the conversations that you end up having with other people when they ask you, what are you going for? What did you do? So community at large, I don't really know to what effect that I've had, but at least in my personal life with my mom, so much of my research has been about the similarities and the differences between the experience of breast cancer patients and trans individuals. And my mom is a breast cancer patient, so in having these discussions with her, I think that I can see the changes that it's making in her perception of the trans community and those issues. And so given like my constraints and my emotional and physical like barriers or whatever, it's like that's sort of the change that I see. So I think that it can happen. And so for me, the idea of coalitions between breast cancer patients and trans individuals against, particularly the TSA, I think that there's a lot of potential there. I can see it like through my mom, but I will admit that some things get on the back burner when I'm trying to like exist and eat and get my magical degree so I can continue to live and eat.
Wonderful panel. I enjoyed all papers. This is this is a question for Eli, really. This is a lovely piece of work, by the way. And I found myself being really persuaded, especially by the analogy, the organizing analogy that you make between bodies of flesh and the body politic. But of course, in giving a short paper, one might have to drop off certain kinds of trouble or contradictions. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about ways that analogy may not be seamless. That in other words, there may be some trouble in making the analogy between actual lived experience of bodies of flesh and the larger, if you will, more symbolic body politic.
Well, of course, this analogy is very, it's not sorry, this is very difficult for me, I have to confess. As you can see from my paper, it's very difficult for me to explain things in English.
Well, I kept thinking if I were trying to do it in another language, that would be maybe impossible. So, who does?
But obviously, it's just an analogy that is based upon small details. Of course, Judaism is not like feminine completely, and in Israel is not masculinity at all, like at every aspect of it. But I think that the main issue, and I also thought about it when you said about Palestine being feminine and Israel being masculine. Also thought about Judaism. In Hebrew, Yahadut is also feminine, is a feminine name. So I think my main inspiration is just to point these similarities, and think maybe this could like help us. I don't know, and for me and for people I work with as trans academic and activist, to rethink about the ways as Israelis we, I don't know, we could just think of ways of changing our realities.
Sure. Should we get Susan? Susan, would you like to?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to take up a lot of time, but just to address the questions that you're having, I would say that it's not actually an analogy between the body politic and the individual body. That this is exactly the point that Foucault has tried to make when talking about biopolitics, that there's like the techniques that we use to become individuals in society are precisely the ways that body politics are formed, that you become part of a population. The connection between how a population is formed and settled on a territory is intimately related to how we're individualized through particular techniques. And so I really like the paper. I'm just saying it's not an analogy. It's like they're concretely, intimately enmeshed with each other. So
Let me say one thing and then get to Saffo. I find one thing that just occurred to me is the politics of the politics of the demographic phenomenon that people talk about over there. The fact that Palestinian women are having many children than Israeli women, emphasis in this and that. And there again, there's this interesting kind of third relationship, that the land between the Jordan and the sea will be, at some point in the not too distant future, become majority Palestinian because Palestinians are having children at a much higher rate. And there's also an interesting politics when, in terms of pregnancy and children in different countries, China with its one-child policy, and also Romania under Ceausescu, where women were not only encouraged to have many children, but abortion was made illegal, and all sorts of interesting and unfortunate and tragic aspects of that whole national policy. So, interestingly enough, it can be, as Susan said, more than just an analogy. It can actually end up producing really interesting and sometimes extremely problematic policy effects. Saffo?
I think that the way that you outline that, I think it raises some interesting questions about sort of the gender politics of these colonial anxieties, and I'm thinking about Fanon here, but I'm also I'm thinking how is within that narrative, how is Palestine gendered? I think is the question. What do, within this Zionist narrative, what do Palestinian masculinities or femininities look like? So Jasper before writes about how the terrorist masculinity and how it's there's always this kind of failed masculinity that's queered at the same time that is also hyper-masculine. And the other thing that I'm curious about, your genealogy from the history of European Jews to Israel in terms of how Jews were gendered and how Zionism and the colonization of Palestine changes that, or is an attempt to change that. And so another question that I'm wondering is, where are non-Ashkenazi Jews in that narrative? Where are Mizrahi Jews and other Jews of color? Within that narrative, and how do these things become gendered within this sort of multi-tiered settler colonial apartheid regime, where there's different subjectivities, some of which are visible, some of which are invisible.
This is of course an Ashkenazi narrative that starts in Europe and goes into modern Israel, and within it, Mizrahis they're both absent and feminized. And their feminization is setting them lower in the hierarchy of the cultural space of Israel. Yes, completely. And in order to set themselves, I don't know, as male, if I can use it like this, we have this phrase, ishtaknezut, to become Ashkenaz, to appear Ashkenaz. So Mizrahis they're expected to aspire to be more Ashkenazi, to the academics, for instance, speak proper Hebrew, other ways of passing.
There's an interesting contrary kind of gender thing here in terms of the way that being Jewish is sort of determined by the state of Israel, and it's determined through the mother's line, right? So if your mother was Jewish and your mother's mother was Jewish, then you might be Jewish. But if your father was Jewish but your mother was Arab or something else, then it's interesting how gender and race, ethnicity, and religion are all strangely coded by governmental authorities, by the Israeli state.
This is also body politics in the way that mothers Judaism is set through mothers because it's the only way you can prove the child is actually theirs. The father could be anyone. So it's very concrete, physical, bodily, but it sets politics and the political state.
Right. It's also a bit anachronistic in the age of DNA testing, right, and paternity testing. But it's interesting. I have an acquaintance who is her mother and mother's mother were both Jewish, and her father is Iraqi Arab, but because she can trace her Judaism through her mother and her mother's mother, then she's this full certified Jewish woman under Israeli law, even though she has an Arab name, which is so. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
I would just like to bring it back to what you were saying in the beginning, and as an undergraduate, I guess dealing and grappling with academia and activists, and I've had professors say they saw so many of their cohorts get kind of screwed by academia because they were so involved in activism and ended up graduating, and how it's a huge trap. So just, I guess, words of advice for someone who's beginning their activist academia career or life work or whatever you want to call it, just to settle my anxieties.
Well, I don't think they'll ever be settled. One word of advice, stay away from the academy. I don't know. But I mean...
Well, if you want a tenure track position and if you want to continue in academia, health science solidarity activism is probably not the most effective. I mean, not to discourage you one iota, but, there are easier ways of getting tenure. I mean, you probably all know there's this project, what is the name of it, where they basically, Zionist project, where they basically go around to classrooms and spy on people.
NGO monitor.
Is it?
NGO monitor. Monitor is, sorry, monitoring academic monitor.
Right, monitoring academia, and they'll go around classes and basically spy on people and get students to say, oh, the professor, or it could be the TA or the instructor, said something terrible, and it was anti-Semitic, or it was anti-Israel, and whatever, and I feel intimidated, and so, there's a project. There are many famous academics who've been born in front of this. I mean, I would say you get Columbia, Richard Cuny, who's teaching at Columbia. He's been attacked many times. He's extremely moderate, but he's been attacked many times, and people tried to get him tossed out from his tenure. So it's not an idle concern. So I mean, my advice to you would be careful when you get to the point of teaching what you say in the classroom. I mean, I hate to have to say that, but it's true. You have to be careful. Yes.
I'm just curious, I'm not an academic, but these academic monitors, do they need to announce themselves, or is the whole idea to be really stealth?
Oh, it's very seldom. It's a very well-funded business. If you look into it, it's quite they have a lot of money, and they go around to campuses and they recruit students and faculty members to basically spy on people and say, oh, this person is teaching this course on race or politics, or it could be anything, and said disparaging remarks against Israel, and that's anti-Semitic, and this person is a threat to so anything critical of Israel, of course, is coded as anti-Semitic, and therefore it's a threat to Jewish students, or maybe other Jewish faculty members, or whatever. And think about what happened with the U.S. Forum at Brooklyn College. How certain city council members and state legislators even threatened to defund the entire college based on a 2-hour event, which is extraordinary if you think about it. So it is, I don't want to use the C word, conspiracy, right?
But who is responsible for setting the agenda of like who's the academic police? Who gets to decide?
Well, it's different organizations.
Or is it sort of vague and there's no transparency? Really?
Right. They're different organizations, and some of it is pretty shadowy.
Yeah.
And this is a multi-million-dollar funded enterprise. This is not just some, this is not like Fred Phelps in the Westboro Baptist Church, right? This is a really well-funded operation. They go around and monitor people what people are saying in classes, Rashid Khalidi, who is completely not anti-Semitic. But, you know, he made one comment, and one student reported into this enterprise and said, oh, you know, Professor Khalidi said something that I interpreted as anti-Semitic, and I felt threatened, and blah, blah, blah. And so, you know, I mean, John, do you know about John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt? They wrote a piece, which you should read. There's both the short piece that was published in the Atlantic Monthly, and also a much longer piece. They're very well-known political scientists, international relations theorists, and they wrote a very well-known piece, which I would recommend to everyone, about the power of the Israel lobby on U.S. foreign policy. And when they wrote this, they were, you know, not surprisingly denounced as anti-Semites, blah, and, you know, there were attempts to get them tossed out. They're both tenured professors, so that was hard to do, and it was unsuccessful. But, you know, to this day, people label them anti-Semites because they pointed out what is, to my mind, a fairly incontrovertible thesis that the Israel lobby has a rather significant influence on U.S. foreign policy. And for saying this, the very incredibly detailed, you know, footnoted research article, journal article that was popularized in a short remake version in the Atlantic, they were just denounced and smeared like you would not believe. If you just Google Mearsheimer and Walt, W-A-L-T, Israel lobby, and you'll find both articles, both the long one and the short version. Yes?
I was just going to mention that there's a handbook that's online put together by a group of mostly anthropologists that gathered experiences of various people of intimidation and spying and anti-Semitism, and goes along with advice about how to handle it, how to document all of your student interactions and so forth and so on for whatever it's worth. It's online. If you Google Jessica Weingart and handbook and anti-Semitism, it'll come up. But I had a question about your presentation. Can you talk a little bit about what do you have an idea of what the LAX transgender sensitivity training was like?
I don't. I know that it was just done for the managers in that time period. Like, I don't think that it was a consistent, we're going to do it regularly training. It was just that one time, as far as I know. But I don't know to what extent or what the training consisted of.
Who's back there? Whoever had their hand up.
Okay. Great panel and really tremendous presentations, all of you. Thank you so much. When I was speaking yesterday, I made this claim around there not being a lot of discourse on pinkwashing that addressed trans folks and the situation of trans, and I'm just really excited at this very substantial evidence that I'm entirely wrong about that. That discourse is emerging all over the place. So I guess what I'm interested in is particular articulations. So Taylor, I really enjoyed your paper a lot. I'm curious about how trans subjects are making use of this technology. I appreciated the attention you paid to Dan Irving's cautions around the marginality, economic, social, etc. I'm thinking about the question of which trans populations are actually gaining access to this leisure travel that you're describing, and I'm wondering whether that marks on to how that relates to people's economic precarity. Do people take on greater economic precarity? Are we talking about populations who are relatively privileged in economic terms, or are we talking about populations who, for instance, folks doing sex work, who are traveling for labor and also traveling for leisure, and who may be traveling in ways that complicate north-south divides as well, So I'm curious about the positionalities of folks within the sort of developed division you articulate vis-a-vis how people access this leisure surgery. Saffo, I was interested in your paper, the way in which you took up the notion of interpolation into this economy, and I guess I wondered if you'd like to say a bit more about how the signifier-signified split allows for thinking through some of the problems with how Masada has been taken up. So, two different questions, but I guess I'm curious as to how subjects find their way into some of the discourses that then, and positionalities that are assimilable to these neoliberal homonormative and homonationalist tendencies.
Okay. Well, I think that you're very right to point out that for a lot of this isn't necessarily, privileged trans individuals or relatively privileged trans individuals, but for a lot of this, the affordability factor does play into the fact that it is an attractive option for a lot of these individuals who might be more marginalized. So I'm very sensitive to the distinguishing between developing and developed. I really struggled with that. But overall, I do think that I was trying to get at country level ways of general understanding, and the fact that physicians come here to train and then return back. I think that all of those are really important considerations that I wanted to take into account, but I do recognize that obviously this does provide an option for more disenfranchised individuals. However, I think the ways in which that these services are presented is that they are presented for the more economically privileged. We see in the images, we see, typical normatively white trans women. We don't see a person of color or anything like that. So I think that you're very right to point out how these services might actually be used for diverse populations within the U.S. But I do think that how they're being presented and who they actually are projecting, who they think their customer base actually is, just replicates existing power structures within the U.S.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for an excellent question. I think, I can speak first about the signifier-signified split, which I didn't get enough. I didn't get enough time go deep enough into. I think in my paper is sort of a preliminary thought, but I mean one of the sort of ambivalences that I feel like we're constantly grappling with someone like Joseph Masada and with these larger questions is. I think there's sort of, the limits of genealogy. How far can we get with genealogy? So we can trace these signifiers, terms like gay or queer, and say, okay, well, they have a Western origin, or and so it's debating, is this a colonial practice? Is this a liberatory practice? And that genealogy can get very deterministic. It can get into this space of, things are determined by, whether they're Western or not is determined by their genealogy as opposed to how they're rearticulated or reappropriated. And I think that in terms of the signifier signified, I mean, there is this question that we're constantly grappling with when we talk about queer subjects, right? Are we talking about, I mean, this is going back to Foucault, right? Are we talking about sex acts or ways of being gendered, or are we talking about language? And I think especially with the trans subject that gets incredibly complicated. So for instance, the documentary I mentioned, Dangerous Living, coming out in the developing world, which, by the way, if you want to see a really well-made piece of gay international propaganda, I definitely recommend checking out that film. It's an interesting specimen. So for instance, there's, I had this tension. Me and a colleague of mine did a presentation on the film a while ago, and we had this ambivalence because there's these interviews with these activists who, we're not critiquing their life narratives, right? Like, we're not critiquing, how, I mean, maybe you have a criticism. Some, they're maybe what they felt was strategic, but it's really about how is this narrative assembled by this Western company who says that this all happened to be a Stonewall. For instance, there's a story of there's an interview with a trans woman in the Philippines who tells the story about how you know, she was at this internet cafe and she Google searched, you know, gay men who look like women, and learned this term transgender, and it has this moment of, oh, okay, aha, like that's who I am. And so the question is, who gets to narrate that experience? What do we, you know, like, I think that with an approach like the narrative, like this you know, this anti-colonial critique of the gay international, there's a tendency to flatten that. You know, do we call that imperial? Do we call that, you know, like, and I think that within that sort of subject formation, I think that we do need to have a room for a kind of transcendence that's not simply, it's not simply immanent. I mean, part of the response, I think, to pinkwashing is this kind of radical immanence where everyone is situated contextually. And Jasper Poor actually quotes, I believe it was Ray Chow making the argument that, you know, this kind of radical immanence has become in and of itself a kind of universalizing project where we're always looking to describe differences. So I think that there's a need to have a space for a kind of transcendence within that's not happening within historical time. And I think that semiotics can be useful for that. In terms of subject into discourse, I think that I mean, one of the many hesitancies I have with this is, so, and I agree, you know, transness has not been talked about for the most part within pinkwashing and homonationalism, you know, text so far. I mean, you know, if we think of, you know, Jasper Poor and Joseph Mossad are the two main, you know, academic texts or authors that come to mind. You know, there's no mention really of trans people, and it's performing the same kind of collapsing that a lot of both LGBT politics and queer theory does, where we can collapse LGBT or queer into being about sexuality and not about gender. And I think that part of the threat that transness has for gender ontologies poses unique questions in terms of pinkwashing and homonationalism that I think we need to address. But I think that, but I have this hesitance of, you know, saying, oh, we should include trans people. It's like, you know, are we saying that, you know, we need to include trans people in pinkwashing because, you know, that's not what I want, right? What kind of will to discourse are we performing, and what kind of, you know, and I want to take seriously the, you know, the challenge that Honey Mikey made in her keynote yesterday, that, you know, pinkwashing is not about queer politics, like, you know, like this is about Palestine. And so the question is, and this is a hesitance that I have, you know, I'm writing this paper about my experience as a white Western trans woman, like doing solidarity work, and I think that this raises some really interesting questions, but at the same time, it's about me, right? And so the question is, like, where does one, you know, what does one do with this transgender subject? I don't know.
I'd like to, before we go to the next session, just briefly mention that there were 3 transgender people on the first U.S. LGBT delegation tour to Palestine. I was one, and there were 2 trans men. And so there was, interestingly enough, transgender representation, as it were, in this important historic tour last January. And I'll also mention briefly that at Queen's Pride House, which is the LGBT Community Center of Queens, we're going to have our first forum on Israel-Palestine on May 2nd, which will have Sarah Schulman, as well as Saed Atshan and Nadia Awad, who will show a portion of the film, which is a documentary about the delegation tour. So all of you who are in the area, will be in the area around May 2nd, I'd like to invite you to come for that very important panel discussion on May 2nd. Okay, there was another question.
Yeah. Hi, so I'm in grad school, but as a social worker, so my area of academics is very different. It's about, like, what do we do? Like, how does this, like, you know, daily life interacting with people? Clinical social work, I should say. And so if other people are understanding what I'm saying and phrase it better, or help me phrase my question, that's great. Feel free to jump in. And so I'm responding to kind of an initial gut feeling, because that's what I'm trained to do. And so I want to offer pushback or questioning about this idea of So if we are trying to do this academic activist split, or not, and create kind of this whole integrated person, and there's this idea of certain activism not being a good commodity to have on your CV, and I'm not trying to downplay the reality of the fact that there are these people coming in trying to critique and kind of say, like, you can't have this stance because then you're anti-Semitic, and but the idea of then we need to watch what we say in the classroom, or we need to watch our politics, doesn't that kind of reproduce the exact thing that we're trying to critique? And so then what do we do with that? Because then we are reproducing the education in which we are critiquing and trying, in what I've heard all day yesterday, is trying to dismantle. So then how, like, what does that look like in reality, and how do we dismantle the thing that is saying we need to self-monitor what we're doing in the classroom? Because what I'm hearing is that we wind up self-monitoring because we are afraid of the outside power above us, you know what I mean? So we don't need somebody else to come in and say you can't do it, because the fear of what could happen is enough to watch, to make you self-monitor. So kind of like, what do we do with that? I don't know. And so if anybody can explain that better or in more jargon, go for it. But that is my social worker question.
And I'd like to know how the institutions are allowing that to happen themselves. I mean, that's a big question, isn't it?
If I could answer. I think the institutions don't have any way to control it, because these people are students. They're coming into the classroom. They're listening to the class. You know,
so they are students. They're not outsiders. They're not like coming in and kind of infiltrating as a.
From what I've understood,
there is some cases there are students.
Sometimes it's just students, and you can't really control it in large classrooms. You can't really know who comes in and what they think. And so when they just report these people to an organization that has power, you could write letters to the dean, and so, you know, it's. But I wanted to address your question, because I think this is just a very extreme example of what happens in everyday life in everything we do. You know, I'm thinking about how I'm going to speak right now so that people won't judge what I'm saying or report me to someone, or, you know, call my mom. So yeah.
But do you know what I mean? So the question is, why are we self-monitoring in the classroom? Why aren't we working? You know, like, I just want to push back to the idea of we need to watch what we say and where we put and how, what, you know what I mean? Because then we are just doing exactly what we are criticizing.
I think there's a different, I would make a distinction here. I mean, what I'm saying is, I think, honestly, you have to be careful, because there are these organizations that recruit students to monitor classrooms. And what I'm saying is, I'm not saying don't talk about Israeli occupation or apartheid. What I'm saying is you have to be careful in how you do it, and the terms in which you couch critique, because the reality is there's some very powerful, very well-funded organizations that have, they recruit students on college campuses throughout the country. And if you say something that doesn't go along with their party line, they will take action against you. And I think that's just a cautionary, that's just a word of caution that's realistic. This is happening at Columbia. It's happening at other universities and colleges in this area and in other places in the country. And these organizations are very powerful and well-funded, and sometimes they have allies on the faculty or on the staff. And college administrations, generally speaking, are completely pusillanimous, and generally speaking, don't stand up to these kinds of bullying tactics. And so I'm not saying do not. I'm absolutely not saying don't critique Israeli occupation or apartheid. I'm saying just be very careful in the terms that you use and in your interactions with students. If you're a grad student, a TA, an instructor, a professor, because they may come in. They may. Okay, there.
Sure. To to me, like in some ways, like I hear about this sort of thing, and it's really useful to like acknowledge that there's a very intentional, resource-based, like you're talking about, you put a lot of money into it. It's not that this is a thing that exists and something to worry about and it can affect you. It's just an intentional campaign to attack, and it's good to recognize that. On the same way, I look at like academia and I'm like, it's the first world problem meme. It's kind of like, it kind of strikes me in that way. I'm like, most people have to couch what they say in like everyday life. I mean, like, you have, like, if people can't talk about so many things, like, yesterday we went to a restaurant and I said like we're terrorists, and I'm not from New York, so, I don't, I joke about terrorism a little bit more openly than and then like, oh, the T word. I was like, oh, I didn't know people said the T word. I thought that, just joke about terrorism and sure people look at you funny and feel uncomfortable, but it's okay. Then I was like, oh yeah, no, actually it might be a little bit even more here, like you're coming to New York and you say terrorism, and, especially if you're, not white, then it's a whole different thing than what it is like even living in, I live in the United States, I live in another like city, I live in Denver, but it's just, people have to couch what they're saying all the time, everything they say, and I think that academics having to do it is like in a privileged way compared to people who have to live the daily life or the daily reality. Anyway, it's just, I think it's still privileged.
I just wanted to say that I think that most people who have done any kind of work with information Palestine are well aware of the kinds of attacks that you can become subject to. So I think that your point just goes to re-emphasize that that you're taking something on that can be overwhelming, exhausting, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that it's something that will keep. There was a fear when these attacks became particularly heightened in the early 2002 and thereafter, that there was going to be this kind of chilling effect on discourse on Palestine, on publishing on Palestine, on activism in Palestine, and in fact that's really has not happened at all.
I think my larger question though goes, I hear it specifically, it's rooted in this moment about anti-Semitism and Palestine and Israel, but my question is like larger in terms of if we so buy into the fear tactics of that they are going to do this and that we need to do this, and what I'm hearing is that there is a self-monitoring going on because there is this risk, then what we are doing as educators and as academics, if we're couching it or whatever we're doing because of this fear and this self-monitoring that we're putting on, then we are doing the exact thing that we are reading the theory that is criticizing that we're saying we're supposed to dismantle. I don't know.
I disagree with you. I think that you just have to sort of really make sure you can stand by what you're saying and not be sort of flippant about it.
Yeah, there are two questions or comments here. I'm not saying don't engage in a critique of Israel. I'm just saying be careful. Choose your battles and be careful how you couch your critique, because people are monitoring. It's not don't do it, it's do it, but be careful how you do it, because there are people who are out there. There's a comment or question there.
Oh, I just say that that kind of self-policing is the basis of modernity, and that's how modernity works all the time. We're policing ourselves. That's how the panopticon is designed to function. But I don't think that means that, just because that is the status quo, I don't think that means we should think it's okay either. And I was just reading in Sappho's piece on queering anarchism about the situationist slogan of "kill the cop inside your head." And I think that's a good motto to remember.
But I think also, I understand your frustration, but I don't think self-monitoring, when you think about the ramifications when you don't, and so your comment, I think it's true, but also academics take very different positions, and so it's going to be different for a TA to speak out in favor of Palestine versus a tenured faculty member. And so while I understand the frustration, I do get your theoretical claim.
Well, because the thing is, what you risk losing is you risk losing privilege, and that's what nobody wants to give up.
But,
so that's,
losing that privilege also has direct material conditions that I think you also have to attend to.
Right, I'm just saying that if we're all doing this, then we all are, we're all complicit in it, is what I'm saying. And so then we're teaching it.
First of all, I think that this conversation is sort of going in circles. But I think that one of the things that we're tripping up on is and this is something that I think happens a lot in movement spaces, is we're stumbling between prescription and description. On one hand, there's a larger structural reality that we're dealing with, and there's structural reasons why these things are being reproduced, such as reasons why academics might be less inclined to speak up about Palestine. And I think that in order to mobilize politically, we need to take stock of descriptively, like what is the structural situation that we are enmeshed in. And it's a reality that there are, for better or worse, however you feel about it, there are reasons why academics aren't going to speak up about Palestine or are less inclined to. And so that's on the descriptive side. On the prescriptive, there's the question of, okay, so what do we do now? And in order to say what do we do now, first of all, who is the we we're talking about? And what kind of prescription are we making? I mean, what I hear in Pauline's advice is a kind of social reproduction in the sense of, that within academics of like, we do have this discourse of, this is how you should navigate the system. And that is a kind of roadmap, but it's also a kind of social reproduction at the same time. And as an academic space, quote unquote, that this space is, that's going to, that's part of being an academic space. As an activist space, on the other hand, we have this very different kind of episteme that we're operating in, which is the question of logistically, like where is this movement at, and what are we doing, not as academics, but as a movement. And I think that there's a tension back and forth between these things. And I think that is part of the root of this larger question about the activist academic space and the kind of social reproduction that happens within activist academic spaces.
Right, but before I take two other comments, I'd just like to clarify here. I mean, I think there's a binary opposition being set up here, which is, oh, if you're engaged in self-censorship, that means you can't challenge that Zionist discourse, that any criticism in the academy or Israel is anti-Semitic. I'm not saying that at all. You can and you should, but you also have to recognize the reality, which is that there is a very large and well-funded network of individuals and organizations that are monitoring academic spaces. And if you fall prey to that and say something that gives them ammunition to take you out of, a tenure track position or manage your career to the point where you can't reach that position if that's your goal of a tenured position, then that means you're taken out of circulation and you're no longer able to serve as a voice to articulate that critique, right? It's just a very practical thing, and it's not limited to Israel-Palestine, it's true of other areas as well. It's just that in this particular area, there is a very well-oiled Zionist machine, one arm of which is monitoring academic discourse. And we should challenge that, but the ability of people to challenge that is also based on the ability of people to achieve positions in that academic hierarchy. That's the reality. Okay, you're having
About what you say is to come from the perspective of privilege. Have some people is out privileged enough to lose their job in the academy or in other places. I come from the place where we start, from Israel, and there have a lot of people that lose their job. They have not, they become to like, they have the start the decision if to speak or they have not what to eat. So not everything is about privilege. Sometimes it's about the survival. And you should to know that how do you speak can to bring you to these places. Have a lot of stories about it. And the other side is that we should to remember the academy is the base for the occupation, to colonize all over the world and in Israel too. And because of this, part from the academy is to support in this occupation and not to deal or to speak against them in some terms again to bring the Israel to end the occupation. So this is apart from this building machine
I wasn't I'm not trying to, I was suggesting within the space of academics. I'm not saying that everybody blanket should just go out and speak whatever they want and not worry about feeding families. And so I'm not speaking that it should be like that global, but I'm just saying that in a very particular academic space, that there's certain things, what do we do with that balance between teaching one thing and doing the thing that we are teaching or criticize? Do you know what I mean? I guess
no one don't do this.
There. Yes.
Oh, I wanted to sort of speak to your comments kind of from the perspective not of an academic, but of somebody working in human services.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm fortunate that I work for an agency that's quite liberal. I'm not a social worker, but I do work in human services. But of my colleagues, I'm definitely the one with the most radical politics. You know, my bosses know this, and they've sort of come to expect it. But you had said something about sort of like, you know, when you're working in human services, you learn to trust your, you know, to go from your gut.
I was just saying that what I was responding to myself, not you.
Okay.
Like the reason I am talking and trying to think about this is because I noticed a shift in me and like, ooh, that didn't sit well. Not because I'm coming from a theoretical understanding or academic framework. So I wasn't putting that out as like a you.
No, but I wanted to sort of get to the idea of sort of self-policing and self-censorship, because in my work, you know, there's certain moments where, I mean, in general, it's not my place to sort of talk about my politics within my work, but because I work with disability rights, there are opportunities for the linkings of different kinds of oppression. So there are opportunities where, you know, we're talking about disability rights, but then different political components come into it. So I think it sort of goes back to what Pauline was saying, is it's not that you can't say certain things, it's how you say them and within what context, and that's not necessarily a bad thing or a negative thing, really. I think, and it isn't necessarily replicating, I mean, perhaps in academia it is, and that's not our world, so I don't know it, but at least within the services world, there are opportunities where various things can link together and where your sort of intrinsic politics actually lend themselves to a situation and kind of become an information sharing opportunity for all the people involved. And so I think, I take some comfort in that. I mean, there's sometimes where I bite my finger and I don't really want to say stuff, but I just know it's not the right time or place. And then later opportunities do come up and it's sort of a better time and place to talk about things, and it's kind of more effective in terms of allowing a little bit of my activism to come into my professional work in a way that sort of makes sense and is helpful for everyone.
I just wanted to step in because I think this is an important conversation, but I also know that we've been sort of harping on this one for a while now, and there's a whole lot more that I think is brought up. I would be more than happy to continue talking about this question with folks afterwards, and I imagine other folks would too, but I also wanted to encourage if there's folks who have questions about other aspects of what's been brought up in the conversation.
Yeah, and actually we've run out of time.
We got out of it.
If anyone has any last comments or questions?
So we've all decided to quit academia. That's just what I'm making sure, right? Everyone has made that decision. They decided that academia is jail and it's impossible to work with. So anyway.
They had the best conference.
Oh, there was free alcohol last night.
Anyway, we have run out of time, and I'd like to thank all the panelists and thank you for coming. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to talk to us afterwards. As I mentioned, I'm involved in the Discourse space. We're trying to hear it. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, please let me know. Thank you, everyone.
The event that's happening on May 2nd. What time is that going to be?
It's 7 to 9 p.m.